Before we start, I'd like to mention that I shot part of this video before I put the first coat of paint down for the scenery, and part after, so that's going to look a little bit inconsistent. Consider yourself warned. This is a Bachmann Spectrum HO scale 460 steam locomotive. They made two versions of this engine, one with 63-inch driving wheels and a high boiler, which is this version, and one with 52-inch drivers and a low boiler. The high boiler version is no longer made, but Bachmann does still make the low boiler version, although it's no longer part of the Spectrum line. I have one of each, and the other day it occurred to me to wonder, what would happen if I combined them? Now, the basic idea of this project was to swap the driving wheels from the high boiler engine onto the low boiler engine, and I suppose vice versa. The high boiler ones should fit easily on the low boiler engine because the axle spacing and valve gear is identical, as is the internal drive line, and there is still enough clearance between the running board and the top of the drivers. I even found a prototype for it, a series of 10 65-ton 460s built by Baldwin in 1907 for passenger service on the Southern Railway, known as the F8 class. While I was at it, I also put the small drivers on the high boiler engine just to see how it would look. It ended up looking like something built for logging or heavy freight work. Now, I neglected to film the actual conversion process, but I will take one apart and show you what I did. The first step was to unscrew the crank pins. These use tiny flathead screws. Once the screw is out, you can take off the eccentric crank and the driving rod. The connecting rod can stay where it is. The newer version of the model also has a little spacer ring behind the driving rod. Do the same thing on the other side. Now you can take the cover plate screws out under the engine, swing the cover plate up out of the way, and lift the axles out of the frame. In addition to the wheels, you'll also have to swap the cover plates between the two engines, since the pickup wipers won't line up with the different size wheels. To do this, unsolder the wires going to the wipers and solder them onto the other cover plate when you put it on. On the older Spectrum version, both wires are black, so it's a good idea to mark one with paint so you don't accidentally reverse the polarity. Once the cover plates are swapped, you can swap the axles themselves and put it all back together. This is mostly pretty straightforward, but it may take a few tries to get the pickup wipers in properly. Gently squeeze them toward the center so that they go in behind the wheels, instead of getting wedged up in front of them. Make sure the axle is in the right way round. These little tabs should be pointing towards the top of the engine, and this joint should be to the rear of the center axle. Getting the crank pin screw in can take a few tries. I find it's helpful to rotate a partial turn as you put it in, so the threads engage and hold it there. The eccentric crank should line itself up at the correct orientation by itself as you tighten the screw. Since the engine now sits at a different height, you'll also have to swap the leading trucks. You may have to loosen the cover plate screw to get it out. My high boiler engine had a metal spring behind the leading truck, while the low boiler one didn't. I don't know if this is true for all of them. It seems to work best to install the spring on whichever engine has the larger drivers. At this point, the swap was pretty much done. As a final touch, I replaced the front couplers on both engines with over and underset shank couplers respectively to compensate for the height difference. This swap really changes the character of both locomotives. The low boiler engine looks like a fast, nimble passenger locomotive, well, by 1907 standards anyway. It would be a relatively small engine for the time, but a very handsome one, and could easily be the pride of the fleet for a small short line. With some detail changes and a green paint job, it would be a pretty good facsimile of a Southern Railway F8 class. The high boiler engine, on the other hand, looks very utilitarian. It reminds me of logging locomotives with tiny driving wheels built for torque over speed. It looks a bit silly with passenger cars, but right at home, pulling a long, heavy freight train. While I don't think that's as pretty as the low boiler engine with large drivers, and I did have a somewhat harder time finding a close prototype match, it's certainly plausible as a freight engine, or even a former passenger engine that was modified for switching. I've essentially taken a large mixed traffic engine and a small mixed traffic engine, and turned them into much more specialized variations on the same wheel arrangement. Well, that about wraps up the saga of this project. After this was all over, I did decide to swap the wheels back onto the original engines, but I do have plans for the future. When one or both of these engines finally kicks the bucket, I'm going to combine parts from both to make one working super 10-wheeler, and I think it's going to have the low boiler and the large drivers, because that's the look I like best. Until next time, folks, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and I will see you next time.